many people in the area knew that this might be the targeted area and had been evacuating for some time. That said, we should still be aware of the civilian casualties that might be at play, because this is a neighborhood after all. But I would say that this was something that was to be expected.
And of course, there is a lot we don't know, including what casualties may have resulted from this. We just know that Israel was targeting a Hezbollah commander, but of course we know that Israel often targets specific people, and there is more collateral damage that comes with it. We just had a headline from N12 TV citing an Israeli official saying that they are not looking to start a regional war. Does that just depend, though, on the response that Hezbollah may deliver to this? Israel has made its move?
I would say that for Hezbollah and for Israel, a regional escalation is not in the cards, or at least they don't want it to be in the cards. That said, there could always be an escalation essentially by accident, which is essentially what happened with the Majd al-Shams attack that you mentioned that killed 12 young people so recently. This was a mistake, essentially. It seems like it was a strike that was a mistake. And so it's just something like that, just any kind of spark that could lead to a wider conflagration, and that's what we're all very, very worried about. Right now, I think Joe Biden and others within the administration are working very, very hard not to see that regional escalation, because that would essentially mean a two-front war for Israel as well.
What is Iran telling Hezbollah right now?
I would say that Iran also does not want much of an escalation at this point. It is getting major political points within the region, and I would say in the world, for everything that the Israeli officials are doing pretty much on their own within Israel in terms of what's the horrific humanitarian catastrophe going on in Gaza right now, but also what's going on within Israel in terms of the political turmoil there. So it doesn't seem to me that Iran would really need to do much to damage Israel's standing any further.
So if this is a matter of incentives to not escalate further, whose incentive is greater to be holding back here? Is it Israel or Iran and its proxies?
So that's a good question. So you're saying Israel, but really what we're talking about is a handful of Israeli politicians.
The Netanyahu government.
Right, the Netanyahu government, which I think is different than necessarily what the interests of Israelis or Israel would be. And that's concerning, and that's been concerning for U.S. officials for some time, that Netanyahu might prolong a war, even expand a war, so that he could maintain control within the government. That said, I think the Iranian officials will probably try to mitigate the larger consequences of this war, but also use all of the internal turmoil that's going on in Israel and what's going on in Gaza to really build up more political points here. That said, you're poking the bear being Hezbollah, and there might have to be other retaliatory strikes depending on the extent of the attacks that we've just been talking about.
Well, that's a great point, that we might not be done here,
right.
Which is why we do want to be cautious with our analysis in the early going. But what does this mean for Hamas? What does this mean for Gaza at this point, as everyone turns their attention to something potentially more in the north? There's much to be resolved still. We've broken down our temporary pier. They're still struggling to get humanitarian aid into an area that you just qualified as a humanitarian crisis.
What is happening right now in Gaza is horrific, and we've just heard reporting just last week that there's been evidence that polio might be spreading within Gaza as well, which should be terrifying not just for Palestinians but for the larger region as well. Speaking of regional escalation, this would have been the moment that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and the administration could have potentially used to increase humanitarian aid and access into Gaza to mitigate a larger escalation, actually, an epidemic in a sense. We haven't seen that yet, but that needs to happen. There needs to be a ceasefire in order for actual proper response to this, potential threat to Israel as well. But we have not seen that yet because there's been a lot of other distractions in the north, but also within Israel itself. And so it's unclear after Netanyahu's speech last week in Congress whether there will be a ceasefire deal.
Well, and we know that negotiators were working on that in recent days. They were meeting in Rome. We heard from the Prime Minister's office, Netanyahu's that Hamas was changing some of its demands. What do you think the real prospect is of a ceasefire agreement, temporary or otherwise, being reached in the near term when they have been trying at this effort for months now?
Right. I mean, and we were seriously talking about a ceasefire deal in February, and
Yeah.
and you know we're 10 months in at this point now. I think that it really depends on how much pressure is applied by external elements like the United States or Iran on the warring parties at this point. There was a recent poll actually in Israel that Israelis are primarily blaming Netanyahu more than even Hamas for the lack of a hostage deal at this point. There's a great deal of frustration with Netanyahu on delivering the hostages at this point. And so that could be the political pressure that's needed for Netanyahu to get a plan. Also, Kamala Harris's speech last week was very powerful in the sense that she made it known that it was time for a deal to happen. And so I think that if there is mounting pressure, especially from the north now as well, also within Israel, that Israel might need to decide to take it down a notch in other areas that could potentially be Gaza, and aim for some kind of ceasefire. But it might be too early to tell.